Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and the way I left this bin that you see here yesterday was that I had just released about 1.5 pounds of worms right in the middle of the bin, and what was surrounding them was a whole bunch of diatomaceous earth, the white powder that you see, and it was completely surrounding them all the way around. And I really didn't expect to come down here today and find all the worms kind of jumbled up in a corner over there in a big heap. I had expected that they would just dive down into the material down below, because down beneath the diatomaceous earth and the dry leaves, there is actually some nice damp bedding and some nice food and everything. So I had set up this bin for them a few days ago, and then right before releasing the worms, I had placed a whole bunch of dry leaves and diatomaceous earth across the top. The whole idea was that the diatomaceous earth was meant to sort of become a sort of like a screen or a filter material that the worms would have to pass through to get down into the bed. And if there were any mites that came along for the ride along with the worms, then those mites would get caught up in the diatomaceous earth, and that the diatomaceous earth would wipe them out. So I'm not exactly sure what happened here. In a way, I wish I had the time lapse running overnight so I could have observed what had happened. But you know, these worms have been out here in this bright light now in my wormery for a good number of minutes with this time lapse running, in the hopes that they might, you know, see the bright light and dive down. But I think I'm going to have to give them a little bit of help. So I've I've put on a glove, and I'm going to see what I could do about sort of stirring them down into the nice damp material down below where the damp bedding and the food and everything is. And I really don't know why they're doing this. This is so unusual. But the other weird thing that's, I don't know, I can't explain it exactly why, but there's like this one edge of the bin over here on the very edge, there's just no diatomaceous earth left at all. They just completely ate it, maybe? I don't know. I'm not sure what happened. In a way, I wonder if they might have just actually pushed their own castings. That's might be what happened here. Maybe they actually just, you know, the castings that came along with the worms, they might have actually pushed that material over on top of the diatomaceous earth. That seems like a more realistic explanation. When I first came in here, I thought that they might have actually consumed the diatomaceous earth for some reason, but I didn't really come down here to deal with this bin. I thought that this bin would just be on cruise control at this point. But I might have thrown these poor worms a curveball by, you know, placing them in on top of a whole bunch of really dry leaves and on top of some really dry powder. They might not have been able to sense the fact that right below the surface is some really nice damp material with some food and bedding and everything. So I think I'm going to see if I can give these little guys a break. The whole idea with the diatomaceous earth was that if there were any mites on the worms, and I suspected that there would be a lot of them, because the bins that these worms came out of were pretty severely infested with mites. And I just didn't want the mite problem to carry over when I relocated the worms from those old mite-infested bins into this new bin. But maybe if we can kind of lead them down below the surface a little bit, they'll notice that there's moisture and dampness and food and everything down low. And they can maybe start to get acclimated in their new home here. So this was a total experiment here. The idea was that this diatomaceous earth would maybe get rid of some of the mites. And I guess running the time lapse in the beginning was also intended to see if it would potentially reveal some of the slow-moving creatures that might be on the surface in addition to the worms. So if there were indeed any mites remaining, then I'd be able to maybe catch a glimpse of them. But I really didn't want to leave those worms out on the surface any longer. I figured it was probably best just to, you know, help them get down low. And, you know, at this point, at the same time, if I submerged a number of mites along with those worms, then so be it, I guess. I just don't know how they could have, you know, withstood being out on the surface all night like that. And you know, not wanted to try to dive down. So whatever, I mean, like I said, the reason I came down here was not to deal with this bin here. I came down here because I was actually wanting to deal with the castings that came out of the two bins that these worms came from. And that's what you see all around here. I had actually placed all of the castings that I sifted out using my screen into this bucket over here. And then when I was doing the screening, I collected all the large uncomposted food and bedding bits and all that other stuff into a separate container. And my whole idea of preserving this material this way was to see if any cocoons within the material hatch out, and I might have some additional worms coming out of this material. I had originally thought about just discarding it, knowing that it was pretty much chock full of mites. But I figured as long as I keep it quarantined and away from the rest of my other systems, it shouldn't be a problem. And that maybe if I just gave it a little bit of time, then I could maybe even, you know, reap the benefit of a bunch of cocoons hatching out. So that's the reason I've got another bin very similar to this one right here, same size as a matter of fact. And I did a couple measurements so that the amount of volume occupied within this red bucket is something in the neighborhood of about 810 cubic inches. So it's 9 inches by 9 inches by 10 inches deep. So it's 81 times 10, 810 cubic inches. And I calculated that if I go into this bin over here, which is, you know, 12 inches by 17 inches, if I go to about a depth of 4 inches, which is only about 2/3 of the way deep, since it's a 6-inch deep bin or 7-inch deep bin, and I've got plenty of room in that system to lay in all of those castings, as well as that uncomposted material alongside of it, and kind of create a place where the cocoons could potentially hatch out over time, and then maybe I can collect them up. So it's kind of an experiment. I think it'll probably work, but we'll only know in time. It's one of those experiments where you're going to have to wait and see what the results are. So hopefully what I've done here with these little guys is sufficient just to get them down below the surface. I can still see a few of them are still stuck out here on the top, so maybe I can try to help them get down lower too. But I'm going to put this bin aside. Hopefully we've taken care of these little guys, and I'm going to go ahead and try to set up this cocoon bin, and then I'll technically be done with my migration of the African nightcrawlers from their 2 old mite-infested bins. All right, so let's get to work. So now there certainly isn't a great deal left to do. It's just a matter of placing these materials into this container here, getting things covered up, and letting it continue. I've got a couple other things here. I got some newspaper I'll place on top, as well as a plastic bag over here on the side. I've even got a label to indicate that this is going to be an ANC cocoon bin. And again, I'm just assuming that this thing is littered with African nightcrawler cocoons. And I'm also going into this whole thing with the knowledge that it's also littered with mites. But it did seem like it was, you know, a drastic shame to just do away with all these castings with all those viable cocoons in them. So I think it is, wow, I could totally see the mites just crawling through the material all over the surface. So whatever, I guess, you know, I could have set this up in a number of different ways, and one of the ways could have been to try to just let the material dry and become less and less hospitable for the mites. But I just worry that that would make it into too much of a harsh, unhospitable environment for the worms. So I opted to just use a plastic covering when we get done here to try to preserve a little moisture that does remain in this material. The stuff dried out really nicely. You can tell by how flaky it is and granular it is. And to let it dry out anymore would potentially make it a little bit uncomfortable for the worms, I think. Here and there I could see a couple worms still in the box. Let's see if I could fish these little guys out. Although I can always take care of that later as well. So the majority of this stuff is been screened. It was first light separated to try to get almost all the worms out. But then towards the end I got a little bit impatient, so I just did sort of a big time bulk screening of the material just to get the bigger worms out of this stuff and to relocate them into that other container we saw. But as you can see, some larger adult-sized worms did sneak through the process. But I would have to say that the number of them in this container are pretty minimal. And I'm wondering if it just sort of got aerated as a result of being poured. I thought that it was only going to come up to about 2/3 of the way full. Maybe it will be only about that much once I level it off a little bit. The only reason I'm shoving it over to one side like this is because I wanted to put all of this uncomposted remaining food scraps and bedding bits onto one side so that this stuff over here can eventually just be treated as castings only, and that at some point when it does seem like we've got a pretty good number of worms in here, I'll be able to just feed that side of the bin where the where that reclaimed unbroken down material is located, and that'll just be over on this side. So you can see how nice this material is. I wish it didn't have all these mites in it, because it really is just such fine, beautiful worm castings. And who knows, maybe if I play my cards right, maybe if I'm careful with the types of foods that I eventually put in here to feed the worms once the worms start emerging out of their cocoons, maybe I can, limit it to the types of foods that, don't really spur on the ongoing breeding of the mites. Maybe I can carefully reduce the amount of mites in here by limiting the types of foods that I give to the worms to stuff that the mites don't necessarily like that much. Maybe by limiting the moisture level in here too to a certain point. So while I was going to cover up with plastic, I was going to do so in a way that leaves a good amount of airflow around the edges of the bin, maybe allowing the outer edges to get a little bit more arid and dry. But I just don't want the entire contents of the bin to dry out excessively, because I don't know how long it's going to take for these cocoons to hatch out and for the baby worms to, all come out and become mobile and capable of coming over to where the action's going to be. Eventually, I'm assuming that I'm going to be able to set up all the fresh feedings and stuff over on that side, and that any worms out in this material are going to find it somewhat barren and devoid of food, and maybe even a little bit too dry for their liking. So it is kind of going to be not only just sort of a cocoon nursery, but also a very slow, gentle horizontal migration in a way. So I've got a couple pieces of paper here that I'm going to cover up with. I always like to, for whatever reason, use at least a couple sheets of paper to cover stuff up in my bins. Maybe because when the plastic goes on, I don't want to have the plastic get covered and all kinds of stuff sticking to it. And like I said, I'm going to try to leave a good amount of airflow around the plastic coverings. So I'm going to put the covering on in a way that it doesn't really lock in all the moisture in the bin. It will allow for ongoing drying of the material, but the stuff right down the middle, and I guess on this far edge, can be left to remain pretty much with its current moisture level, but all the rest of it is going to be left to get a little bit of airflow so that hopefully it can dry a bit over time. All right, only one thing remaining to do here, which is to christen it as my new African nightcrawler cocoon bin. And I actually put yesterday's date on it because basically all I'm doing is relocating them, because what I really did in here yesterday is what this represents, kind of the assembly of the environment. The actual container that it's in is somewhat irrelevant. So let's go ahead and tip this up gently without spilling the contents. And we can get this label on here. Okay. There we go. That's all I wanted to take care of today. I guess I got a little distracted by what I was seeing in the other bin too, with all those worms hanging out on the surface, but I think it's pretty interesting. And I'm curious to see what the time lapse looks like. I'm curious to see if there's creepy crawlies and mites on the surface. Hopefully not. We'll see. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. It's always really appreciated. Also, if you haven't done so already, consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Have a great day. Bye.